thrice welcome, King o' Ranton Reel. Poor is the bard to Scotia Leel, who wouldna sing a sic a cheel and sic a glorious fiddle.
It's but a weary while at best, woef and weary, often dreary. It's but a weary while at best, a woef and weary whirl.
It's but a weary whirl at best, gang north or south or east or west, but we will never mak protest when near you and your fiddle.
Let prosy parsons pray and preach, and wise professors try and teach the secrets far beyond their reach. A Stradivarius fiddle.
We'll leave them to themselves to read things sae vexing and perplexing. We'll leave them to themselves to read life's cabalistic riddle.
We'll leave them to themselves to read, to spin their scheme and mark their creed. Come, screw your pins and gie the screed for your unrivalled fiddle.
Nay fabled wizard's wand, I trow, had e'er the magic art o' Gow. When we a wave, he draws his bow across his wondrous fiddle.
Was this king of Ranton Reel, this man with the wondrous fiddle? Well, his name was Niel Gow, and he was born in Perthshire on the 22nd of March, 1727 at Fynduick in Strathbran. Take the road east from there towards Dunkeld, and you come to the village of Inver. And it was to here that the family moved when Niel was still quite young, and this remained his headquarters for the rest of his 80 years. His father was a plaid weaver, and Niel would most certainly have followed in the same trade if, at the age of 9, he had not acquired his first fiddle. Well, it soon became fairly obvious that it was in this direction that his talents lay. In fact, at the age of 18, he agreed after lengthy persuasion to enter a fiddle contest that was being held at Perth. This was in the year 1745. And certainly the Jacobite ongoings of that year don't seem to have prevented some of the best-known fiddlers from all over the country from gathering in the fair city. One of these was John Cameron of Grantley, who was in fact Niel's own teacher. So you can see why Niel was slightly reluctant to enter the competition. But he did, and he won hands down. In fact, the chief judge, who was the well-known blind fiddler John McCraw, declared that he could distinguish the stroke of Niel's bow among 100 players.
Some men try to give spirit to dance music by short jerking strokes with a strong descending bow and a weak ascending. But his was a continuous stream of gorgeous sounds, like an organ at full gallop. There is perhaps no species whatever of music executed on the violin in which the characteristic expression depends more on the power of the bow, particularly in what is called the upward or returning stroke, than the Highland reel. Here, accordingly, was Gow's forte. His bow hand, as a suitable instrument of his genius, was uncommonly powerful. And when the note produced by the up bow was often feeble and indistinct in other hands, it was struck in his playing with a strength and certainty which never failed to surprise and delight the skillful hearer. As an example may be mentioned his manner of striking the tenor C in Athol House. To this extraordinary power of the bow in the hand of great original genius must be ascribed the singular felicity of expression which he gave to all his music, and the native Highland goo of certain tunes, such as Tullach Gorham, in which his taste and style of bowing could never be exactly reached by any other performer. We may add the effect of a sudden shout, with which he frequently accompanied his playing in the quick tunes, and which seemed instantly to electrify the dancers, inspiring them with new life and energy, and rousing the spirits of the most inanimate.
Niel Gow was considered the bow ideal of a Highlander. He was nearly 6 feet in height, erect, firm and square-built, and lithe and active in his movements. He was ever ready with his tongue and hands to speak or work for his friend. There was a peculiar spirit and Celtic character and enthusiasm which he threw into his performances and which distinguished his bow amid the largest band. His appearance, too, was prepossessing. His countenance open, honest, and pleasing. His figure compact and manly, which was shown to advantage in the tight tartan knee breeches and hose which he always wore. There was also an openness, an eccentricity in his manner, which, while it was homely, easy, and unaffected, was at the same time characterized by great self-possession and downrightness. And being accompanied by acute penetration into the character and peculiarities of others, strong good sense and considerable quaintness and humour, and above all, by a perfect honesty and integrity of thought and action, placed him on a footing of familiarity and independence in the presence of the proudest of the land, which perhaps no one in his situation ever achieved either before or since. Many who never heard him play, and who were even unacquainted with his compositions, fired by the accounts of those who lived in his time, talk to this day of Niel Gow as if they had tripped 1,000 times to his spirit-stirring and mirth-inspiring strains.
In the 18th and 19th centuries, Perthshire was famous for its fiddlers, and Inver particularly so. Macintosh, Murray, Hardy, and of course Niel himself, and his sons, especially Nathaniel, were all well-known fiddlers, and this tradition in Inver was continued until not so very long ago.
Oh, the district's proud of Gow. His people were weavers, and whether he ever wove or not, I can't tell you. Maybe he was taught it when he was young. Somebody suggested to me that his father would be a smith because his name was Gow, but he was a weaver. See, Inver was famed for its weaving too. We used to have a pastel drawing of a forebear of ours, Frederick Crerar, who was a weaver, and he had a tartan coat cut on the cross and tartan trews. So although when my father was at school, at the Royal School, we've a photograph with his collars somewhere. Nearly all the boys had kilts on, but not necessarily tartan ones, the tweed ones. My father used to say when there were laddies wading in the river, the kilt would be floating round about them in the water. They didn't bother. And you see, kilts were more thrifty than trews because they wore longer. Whether he ever wove or not, I can't tell you. Maybe he was taught it when he was young, but maybe he made his living off his fiddle, because Niel Gow was recognised by everybody then as a fiddler of some repute. There's a real Ulster Space Society here yet, and they would recognise a Gow tune, I suppose. There's quite a few fiddlers around here, but when I was at Dunkeld School, Inver was still full of fiddlers. Sandy Bain, he was a postman. Funny, John Scott, who was a fiddler of some repute and taught fiddle music, he was a postman too. And Jimmy Macintosh was a postman. And his brother Charlie, who was the Perthshire naturalist, he played the big bass fiddle because he had had an accident at the sawmill and he had some fingers short, so he couldn't play the fiddle, but he played the big bass fiddle. Miss Macintosh's father was a fiddler, and he wrote music too. And her uncles, they were all fiddlers. And her father had a dance band, you know, they had at the time, well, it would be all the Scots country dances and such like, and it had some repute in the district and beyond.
Oh yes, there was a lot of players. And then they had the different bands went out to and come back at the early train in the morning. My father and they went regularly away north and came back in the early morning train and then went off to work. And they had their own band that went out round the country, all the big houses round about. Well, up at Blair Castle and such like.
My great-great-grandfather, John Crerar, had lessons from Niel Gow because he had shown John had shown signs of having some musical ability, and the Duke of Atholl at the time sent him as a young man to Gow to get lessons. And when John was proficient enough, they used to play the fiddle across the river to one another. Niel Gow sitting at his tree and John Crerar on the Dunkeld house side of the water. Eventually John wrote some tunes like the Big Boat Inver and the Merry Lads Inver and the Curler's March to Poolney and the Atholl Forest and names like that. So the receipts of the cost of the lessons was in Blair Castle for a long time, but whether they're there still or not, I don't know. But there was some of John's music in Blair Castle too, because I was showing a friend over the castle once and she was leaning over a glass case and she says, there's some music in here belonging to John Crerar. Is he any relation of yours? So I told her who he was. She hummed the tunes to me. I don't know one note from another. So he was well known as a fiddler, old John, in his day, but he did get his lessons from Niel Gow.
As you heard, one of the reasons that this great fiddling tradition was kept going for so long was that all these fiddlers were playing regularly for dancing. And as any dance band musician will tell you, this is a great discipline. In fact, you could say that Niel Gow was the founder of the modern Scottish country dance band as we know it now. Niel's brother Donald would often be his accompanist on the cello, and in his later days, after Donald's death, it was sometimes hard to persuade Niel to play at all without such a steady accompaniment. Niel and his band used to travel all over the country playing for dances, and he set a trend that has continued to this day, even if the fees are not directly comparable. There's a record that the St. Michael Lodge of Freemasons in Creef paid Niel Gow and John O'Neill 2 and 6 for playing at a function in December 1783. In fact, for years, the sum paid to a musician was from 6 to 5 shillings. 2 and 6 for a fiddler, 2 and 6 for a drummer, 2 and 5 for a fifer, and 5 shillings each for pipers. Now, why pipers should get so much more than anybody else is hard to say, though it is said, and mainly by pipers, that piping is thirsty work. Well, so's fiddling, and anyone who's played for a 5-hour dance will appreciate the need for the odd refreshment. This may have been partly the reason for the reputation Niel has gained after his death as a gentleman fairly fond of a drop from the bottle. Well, I don't suppose he was any better or any worse than any musician before or since. But he was fond of a dram, and this, of course, led to stories. One was even recorded by the English poet Robert Southey.
Recrossed the bridge and proceeded along the side of what formerly was Birnam Wood, of locomotive celebrity. It seems now to have taken its final departure, 15 to Perth by a good road. Someone was praising the bridge to the Duke of Athol, at whose expense it was made in presence of Niel Gow, a performer on the violin of some renown in these parts. Niel, who was a person privileged to say anything, replied, "They may praise your braid roads that gains by 'em. For my part, when I get a wee droppy at Perth, I's just as long again in getting hame by the new road as by the old one." On such occasions, he could manage to keep the road, but it was by a zigzag course, tacking always from one side of it to the other.
On one particular occasion, when the Duchess of Gordon called in to see him at Inver, she was complaining of a giddiness.
Tunes with reference to whisky in the title. Probably the most well-known of these is Farewell to Whisky, which is not, as many people would like to suppose, the lament of a man whose doctor has just told him to give up alcohol, but was written after a ban had been imposed on the distilling of whisky after a disastrous harvest in 1799. From 1774, Niel was paid £5 a year by the 3rd Duke of Athol for his services as a fiddler. But it was the 4th Duke who became Niel's foremost patron. Niel was a frequent visitor at Dunkeld House, where he played for the Athol family, and in the ballroom at Blair Castle, where you can now see one of his fiddles, his drinking cup, and of course his famous portrait. This friendship of Niel's with the Athol family was most unusual for the time. Edinburgh society was absolutely astonished to see the Duke of Athol walking arm in arm through the streets of the city with his fiddler, while the latter was sitting for the selfsame portrait for Sir Henry Raeburn, from whom the Duke had commissioned the painting. But the Duke's patronage was of a kind that Edinburgh was not accustomed to, and the two were firm friends.
The Duke and Duchess walked one day with Niel to Stanley Hill in the neighbourhood of Dunkeld, when his Grace began pushing and struggling with him in a sportive humour until the latter at last fairly tumbled down the brae. The Duchess, running to him, expressed her hope that he was not hurt, to which he answered,
"Oh, nothing to speak o'. I was the mere idiot to wrestle with sic a fool."
at which they both laughed heartily. occasion in Athol House, after supper was announced, a portion of the fashionable party lingered in the ballroom, unwilling to forsake the dance. Niel, who felt none of the fashionable indifference about supper and its accompaniments, soon lost his patience, and addressing himself to the ladies, cried out,
"Gone down to your supper, you daft limmers, and dinna hold me reeling here as if hunger and drouth were unkent in the land. A body can get nothing done for ye."
Mr. Graham of Ochil used to sit up whole nights with Niel Gow, playing reels with him, and on one occasion Niel exclaimed,
Troch or kill, ye play weel. Be thankful. If the French should overturn our country, you and I can win our bread, which is more than money of the great folk can say.
On another occasion, Niel paid a professional visit to James Murray, Laird of Abercairny, where he remained some days. The house was full of company, dancing at night and occasionally listening to Niel's fascinating strains during the day. One very wet morning, in passing through the servants' apartments in search of an umbrella, he observed in the corner the bones of one of these useful travelling companions, without a shred of cloth on it. His jocular mind suggested to him what he concluded would dispel a little of the depression incident to such a morning. So, pushing up the skeleton to its full pitch, he sallied out amidst the pouring rain, and purposely passing the windows of the breakfast room, where he knew the company were all assembled, he held the skeleton umbrella stiffly to the same angle as he would have done had it been covered, and seemed unconscious of the flood that was rising off his bonnet and shoulders like reek. A shout of laughter came from the company inside, and Abercairny, lifting one of the windows, cried,
"Hello, Niel. What's wrong?" "Oh, nothing wrong, Abercairny. But I'm so glad I brought my umbrella. For it's an awful morning."
Despite this leg pulling, there was no home in which Niel was more welcome than at Abercairny. The laird was in his glory once he had got Niel and Mr. Graham of Ochil started to the fiddles, and no friendship could have drawn a finer tribute than the lament Niel wrote after James Murray's death. Two men who set great store by their visits to Niel at Inver were the young Robert Burns and the Ettrick shepherd, James Hogg. Burns visited Niel in 1787, and in fact it was my own great-great-great-great-grandfather, Dr. Stuart of Bunskid, himself a fine fiddler and close friend of Niel's, who introduced the two of them. Burns was so taken with Niel's playing of Locherch's Side, which was one of his own tunes, that he set his poem addressed to the woodlark to it. Dr. Stewart's sister-in-law, Lady Nairn, who wrote Land of the Leal, Will You No Come Back Again, and many other well-known songs, paid a poetic tribute to Niel.
Since first I saw fair Inver's braes, it's langer nor lang syne, but days of youth are blithesome days, and oft they'll come to mind. A cot house and a wee bit land, tween stately tay and rumbling bran, as I he lived a favoured man, aneath a chieftain kind. And I'd been spared a canny time, my days been fair and lang, when thousands pooed in all their prime, why call the clods a man? Oh, Rabbie Burns, were ye knew your Bristow Highland fire was full, gin I could ballads mak like you, I'll dee ya for my son.
Like most Atholl men of his time, Niel was a keen Jacobite, and in between winning fiddle contests, is even said to have volunteered as one of Lord George Murray's recruits in 1745. He saw the exile and the death of many of his fellow Atholl men, and he wrote a fine tune to commemorate the bravery of the volunteers. By the end of the 18th century, music and dancing fashions seem to have changed, and the days of the volunteers must have seemed long past. It was at this time that Niel Gow became a household name in many parts of Scotland. He was in particular demand at the grand hunt balls, and in fact it was after the Caledonian Ball in Edinburgh in 1793 that the following well-known episode is said to have taken place.
The next morning, he marched with firm but heavy step along Princes Street to a music shop, and hammering in, asked for the sight of some fiddle bows. The party in charge took first a look at Niel in order to guess, if possible, the price which he would be disposed to give. Then, selecting one at 2 shillings and 6pence, he handed it to him. It was pushed back with contempt. A second shared the same fate, which rather ruffled the shopkeeper, and to test his customer, he handed him one of the best bows in the shop, the price of which was 25 shillings. Niel looked at it and requested a fiddle and some rosin. To this the shopkeeper demurred, saying, "We never allow our new bows to be rosined." But handing him a fiddle, he said, That fiddle has just been played on, and there is sufficient rosin on the strings to enable you to judge of the bow." Niel took the fiddle in his hand, and casting his keen musical eye along the counter, he observed a copy of a tune he had just published, and asked the shopkeeper to hand it to him, which was done. These confident movements began to amuse the latter gentleman, and feeling certain that his customer could not possibly have seen this, the newest piece out, he said, rather sneeringly, "If you play that over without a pause or mistake, I'll make you a present of the bow." "Done," said Niel. And he played the tune in such a way that his friend was astonished, and in his astonishment forgot his bargain. But Niel reminded him by handing over the bow and saying curtly, "Put it in a piece of paper." The shopkeeper hesitated, saying, You must have seen that piece before." "Aye, to be sure," said Niel. "I saw it 50 times when I was making it." And taking the bow in his hand, he walked out of the shop with the tails of his coat sailing behind him like the loose bunting of a first-rate man-of-war.
Well, like many a Scot, Niel had a good conceit of himself. As Dr. Muir, minister of St. James in Glasgow, found out when, as a young man, he paid a visit to the parish church at Little Dunkeld, where Niel was a member of the congregation, and incidentally in whose kirkyard he lies buried.
Having arranged to remain over the Sunday at Dunkeld, I went to the parish church in the forenoon. During the service I observed an old Highlander with a broad forehead and thin hair staring at me harder than might be thought well-bred. On coming out, I felt my elbow touched, and on looking round, here was my old friend, who, without hesitation, addressed me thus. "I think you're a stranger here, sir." "Indeed I am. I never was here before." "Where do you come from?" "I come from Glasgow. I was born in the bridge gate of Glasgow." "Will you take a bottle of ale?" Oh, no. I'm a young probationer, and I do not approve of going to public houses on the Sabbath day." The old Highlander looked much perplexed, and as I began to move off, he drew himself up, and giving his plaid a hitch, said, "You come from Glasgow, do you?" "Yes." "Then I am the famous Niel Gow, well known in all these parts." Language could not describe the look of importance put on by Niel after he had made this announcement.
Niel was twice married, first to Margaret Wiseman, who bore him his 8 children and died shortly after the birth of his youngest son, David, and secondly to Margaret Urquhart. They were happily married for 30 years, and no artist ever paid as fine a tribute to his wife than did Niel in the air he wrote after her death. There are a lot more things one could say about Niel Gow. A great character, famous fiddler, renowned composer. But the music really speaks for itself.
Taking part in the programme were Miss Crerar of Dunkeld and Miss Macintosh of Birnam. Research was by Alison Barbour, the readings were by Gwyneth Guthrie and John Sheddon, Douglas Lawrence played fiddle, the presenter was Freeland Barbour, and the programme was produced by Billy Kay. You might like to know that there's an exhibition based on the Odyssey series at the National Museum of Antiquities in Queen Street, Edinburgh. There's also a book available called Odyssey, Voices from Scotland's Recent Past. In next week's Odyssey, we tell the story of the steel industry in North Ayrshire, Glengarnock Steel. One of the fears of the workers there earlier this